أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So, there's been a lot of discourse in our metamodern scene lately about metamodern Christianity in particular, but also metamodern religion more generally, and certainly a topic I have some thoughts on, so I figured I would go ahead and record something, which I'd like to start do some more of, and share my thoughts, hopefully to useful ends. So, yeah, metamodern Christianity, interesting topic for me as a non-Christian to be diving into, but yeah, like I said, I think there's things that can be translated from this discussion into other sort of metamodern religious and spiritual projects. So even for those of us who are not Christian, I think there's something worthwhile to be gained in this discourse, engaging it earnestly and such. So before really diving in, I think I'd like to situate metamodernism a little bit, since the field is somewhat contentious nowadays. There are a couple different definitions at play, some of which play nice together, others of which less so, and there's also disagreement about the extent to which these things do play nice with one another. So, let's get this out of the way first, and I'm going to be using a pretty minimal definition of metamodernism here, just as some kind of disposition, orientation, paradigm, pick your word, that seeks to integrate, synthesize, take seriously other historical dispositions, paradigms, what have you. And some of these are certainly modernism and postmodernism, tend to be some of the major epistemes considered, but also relevant here is certainly traditional and archaic. There's very many ways to parse these things, and I mean, this itself is quite contentious, certainly. But yeah, for this discussion, keep it simple, some kind of framework, viewpoint, orientation that, yeah, takes postmodernism, modernism, and traditionalism seriously on their own terms, and seeks to bring them into some kind of synthetic or dynamic relationship. So, yeah, let's turn to religion, Christianity here. One of the things that I think a metamodern perspective is going to be doing and ought to do is present a vision of the religion in question, here Christianity, that is both kind of satisfying from a outsider, more scholarly perspective, but also satisfying as an account for traditional Christians. We're using a devotional a lot in the discourse here as well, traditional devotional, modern Christians and postmodern Christians. So we need some kind of descriptor, some kind of framing, some kind of approach to the religion, to the faith tradition that gives a kind of robust outsider's account, while also giving an insider's account that works for all these different viewpoints. And so, yeah, it's definitely a tall order to find a framing that is that accommodating, while simultaneously having a certain richness to it, without just putting forth something that is so like generic that you kind of lose the vitality, the existential thrust involved in the tradition. So yeah, definitely a tightrope to walk. And in terms of defining a metamodern Christianity in particular, it's not something I myself am really going to venture to do here, but I just thought that kind of framing of what would that even look like to venture some kind of explanation or some kind of just hypothesis of metamodern Christianity. To use some anthropological language, we need a good Edic explanation that's also pan-emic, according to the traditional, modern, postmodern, etc. Perspectives within Christianity. I think that's the kind of basic sort of venture of trying to frame a metamodern wisdom tradition, basically. It's going to need to check the boxes for multiple perspectives in some kind of synthetic and dynamic sort of way. So to move on a little bit more and get into the weeds a little bit here, I think one of the things that is really being grappled with in the discourse right now is certainly truth claims in religious traditions. There's certainly propositional dogmas, doctrines, historical, mythic materials, and these are all intertwined in very complex ways. So trying to figure out how to parse these truth claims from traditional perspectives, modern perspectives, postmodern perspectives, etc., in ways that are satisfying and can play nice with one another, certainly. But at the very least, not be in some kind of outright tension or contradiction. They need to hang together in some kind of coherent way. So one of the things I'm thinking a lot about in this context is just the modality of truth claims. So in what sense is this claim being made, and can it be understood? So we're hearing a lot about historical critical vantage points on scripture, and how these methodologies that really came to the fore in the modern period have done some real, genuinely novel and helpful work in elucidating these historical aspects of a tradition in ways that simply weren't accessible to religious adherents prior to the development of these methodologies. So this complicates things in terms of, now we are getting new information, new perspectives, which say cut against some of the material we find in Scripture itself. At least if we are reading Scripture in a historical from a historical vantage point. If we're taking a text like the Bible and reading Genesis and these Old Testament stories and the Gospels as historical accounts, then you pretty quickly run up against some tensions, some contradictions when taking seriously some of the findings of modern historical critical scholarship. And this can reasonably be a real test for someone's faith if they tend to look at Scripture and as any kind of authoritative document of history, which certainly isn't the only way to take it, and reading some of these, say, dichotomies or dualisms of modernity back onto more traditional approaches to Scripture can be complicated. For example, like we tend to have a dichotomy between, say, a historical reading and a symbolic reading. And this makes good sense from a modern perspective, where these have kind of been parsed out from one another in explicit ways. But we can't really go back and, say, look at the Church Fathers, Augustine, some of these earlier Christian writers, and assume that some of their approaches to Scripture were like purely historical, and they thought of Scripture just as a historical document, even as they thought of it as something more, obviously. That just doesn't quite fit with just the modes of thought that these early Christians had. They were simply thinking about these things not through the frameworks of those same dualities, dualisms, dichotomies. So it's obvious that some of these early Christian writers were thinking about biblical text as historical accounts in some mode, but somewhat anachronistic to try and read back our modern historicist sorts of framings onto their own modes of understanding history. And you can look back at some of these important Christian thinkers, and you can see a very complex scriptural hermeneutics at play that seems to take seriously a sort of plain or literal reading of the text, which perhaps we might consider as a more historical type of perspective on these things, while simultaneously having allegorical, symbolic, existential, mythic perspectives layered on top as well. And it's not always clear that a priority or preference was given in a straightforward way to the literal or historical perspectives here. So yeah, just a word of caution of reading back some of these modern frames onto earlier traditional perspectives within a faith tradition. But nonetheless, with the advent and legacy of modernity, we have inherited some of these dichotomies. So to be a quote-unquote traditional devotional Christian today, we're kind of grappling with scripture, with sacred sources, just from an existentially and hermeneutically distinct position than earlier traditional devotional Christians were. And so that's important to keep in mind. We have these new dichotomies to play with and kind of wrap ourselves around and come to some kind of synthetic perspective around. And that wasn't necessarily the same situation for our ancestors in these traditions. But, I mean, it's certainly something we kind of need to rise up to. I think it's very noxious and pathological to do the sort of move of trying to collapse the dichotomy and either just reading the Bible totally historically as if this was just what Christians have always been doing, and kind of rejecting any kind of modern knowledge that might contradict this sort of plain historical reading, or kind of going the other way and acting as though, this is all allegory, all myth. We can preserve all this material sort of symbolically and metaphorically, and sort of sidestep some of these historicist quandaries. I don't think either of those really have a real vitality to them. I think there's something disingenuous to both of those moves. I think of the two, the more symbolically oriented is a little less pathological, but I think you're losing some of the opportunity to grapple with tradition in a more robust sort of way when you make that move. So how do we do some of these hermeneutics in a little more earnest, authentic, dynamic, robust way? I think in the conversation between Paul Vanderklay and Brendan Graham Dempsey, we saw a lot of dancing, a lot of tango around some of these hermeneutical questions. Paul seemed very hesitant to give a firm answer historically about things like the resurrection, and when he did, it was not really something that was given a real rational basis or a strong justificatory sort of explanation beyond sort of deference to tradition and confessional identity. So Paul will affirm the resurrection of Jesus Christ as a real event simply because he's a confessional Christian. I think there's something lacking to this response. I think there's something deeper than mere group identity and fidelity to tradition that needs to be behind such an affirmation, especially as it's not entirely clear, but it seems as though this is being presented as something that not merely is kind of existentially a real or symbolically true sort of happening or a record of something that has an existential vitality to it. It seems like he's willing to, on a historical level, affirm this happening, which from a modern historical critical perspective, it's a little suspect. There's different ways to do historical critical scholarship. Some have a bit more of a kind of refined or reified physicalist metaphysics behind it. Others less so, and you don't need to sort of affirm a physicalist type of metaphysics to be able to do a historical critical scholarship. But things that from, say, the perspective of contemporary natural science would be considered sort of miraculous or a kind of break with the typical natural laws that have been identified, well, that needs to be bracketed in a certain sense and considered alongside other possible explanations for giving an account of the origin of such reports in scriptural and historical sources, and what explanation seems to do the most work or just have the most plausibility to it. So I think it's too strong of a claim to act as though all historical critical scholarship has this sort of a reified physicalist metaphysics. I just don't think that is borne out in the diversity of these traditions, and so they need not be methodologically wed to such a metaphysics, and not all of the scholarship is. So there's just more complexity there, and trying to say that, the physicalist metaphysics is sort of uncritically adopted frame from modernity. That doesn't sort of refute all that scholarship at its face, because there's just more going on there, frankly. So I think one important thing that needs to happen here is just a real attention to the modality of truth claims. From a metamodern and modern and postmodern perspective as well, these more, say, symbolic or metaphorical readings of Scripture are entirely in accord with the sensibilities. We can understand sort of the resurrection of Christ, existentially like pointing to this affirmation of life, being a symbol for salvation and overcoming our finitude and sin. So there's plenty of possibilities there for interpretations. But there's something really insistent in the traditionalist sensibility that we don't want to sort of collapse down to merely a symbolic level. I think there's something to that. I think there. I don't think that following say more stringent modern perspective that would insist on that because of other metaphysical commitments. I think we want to be somewhat wary of adopting that too wholeheartedly from a metamodern perspective. I think we want to take some of these traditionalist concern about the the literal and historical realness about some of these scriptural things seriously, even as we will need to put these in conversation with other more critical frames as well. So I think an attention to the modality of our truth claims is going to be important here and help avoid a lot of that concern for equivocation that has been a major concern in some of this discourse. Because, yeah, it is important, like, for example, one of the examples Paul brought up, Paul Vanderklay, in the conversation with Brendan, was using this kind of militaristic metaphor of, Uncle Sam walked across the ocean and sort of defeated the Japanese. And yeah, this is obviously a kind of metaphorical, symbolic language. There's certainly truth to it, properly understood as kind of a symbolic account of the American sort of campaign in the Pacific Theater during World War II. It's not an untrue statement just because it is operating in this mode of symbol. But certainly if someone understood that claim as though there were a literal person, Uncle Sam, who's a person in the same way that you or I are a person, somehow walked across the ocean and single-handedly defeated the Japanese forces, this would be a sort of false understanding. This is no longer a true claim. So yeah, the attention to this modality is definitely important in these discussions. So turning back to kind of religious mythic material, I propose that there is a good, we may want to simply bracket some of these things. And I think there's a number of reasons why that may be advantageous. I think too strongly rejecting material that is, say, miraculous or seems to stretch the credulity of imagination from a more contemporary historical perspective. There's a lot of attachment to these things from more traditionally minded folks, and say an a priori rejection of this material is going to definitely cause some tension, some issues in advancing something that is able to be taken up by traditionalists, modernists, postmodernists, etc., as kind of a authentic vision for Christianity or, say, any other religious tradition. So what do I mean by bracketing? So I think we can, as, say, adherents to these traditions, affirm the truth value of something like, say, the resurrection of Jesus Christ after his crucifixion. And I think specifically we can bracket the question of the modality of this truth claim. So this doesn't mean, however, that we can't advance ideas and think through and play with different possible modal frames for understanding this as true. But I think it's important to not collapse down into a specific frame for saying this is how this is true, this is how this needs to be understood to be true. So it leaves the door open hermeneutically to play around with mythos, with sacred sources a lot more. Not necessarily causing the tensions with some of the more traditional adherents of a given wisdom lineage. So within my own Islamic tradition, there's a precedent for this type of hermeneutical move. The Hanbali school of law developed this methodology called bila kaif, which translates something like without knowing how, or something along those lines. So in the Quran, you have these verses talking about God, where it says that, oh, God has 2 right hands and sits on the throne, and all this very kind of anthropomorphic description of divinity, which is really hard to square with the kind of absolute transcendent monotheism that is really at the heart of Islamic theology, both in its more systematic forms, but also within the scripture itself. So as sort of early Muslims, we're grappling with some of the tensions of this anthropomorphic language with a more universal, rationalistic type of monotheism that seemed to be the kind of way to go with developing a more systematic theology. They kind of came to this question, and at least the Hanbali scholars proposed, like, okay, let's not say that this is literally true, that God has 2 right hands, that God sits on a literal throne, but they were also uncomfortable to sort of go the other route and say, oh, this is merely symbolic, this is merely metaphorical, the throne is just a symbol for transcendence and majesty of the divine, and these sorts of things, which, yes, certainly that's a very valid kind of hermeneutical approach to a verse like that. But they wanted to keep things open and not sort of prematurely collapse this discussion into one or the other direction here. So I think a similar hermeneutical move can be very helpful as kind of a starting point here, with the caveat that there's a real danger to this kind of bracketing of modal questions. Can very easily slip into a sort of anti-intellectual standpoint where, trying to consider the modality of a specific event or description in a scriptural source is kind of looked upon with suspicion. So the caveat here is, in fact, we want to explore different modal possibilities of these truth claims with a certain vigor and gusto and enthusiasm and creativity, and ensure that while we keep open and bracket sort of a final definitive proclamation of the particular modality of a truth claim like the resurrection of Christ, that we not only sort of permit but actively extol and valorize explorations of possible modal explorations of how this can be understood as true or authentic or real, alive, any of these sorts of things. This also, though, doesn't mean that there aren't modal claims that could be falsified. So just because we don't want to land on a final right answer doesn't mean we can't disregard certain specific propositions. So here's where, for example, some of the tension between the historical critical and say more traditional devotional things can be sort of worked out a little bit. There's absolutely particular modes of understanding something like the resurrection of Jesus that we may want to reject as a sort of crude historicism and kind of an overreach of trying to read the scripture in this historical key in a way that simply doesn't square with knowledge and understandings of historicity and such. So there's certainly things we can reject, but these ought not be a priori rejections, as can happen if one is, say, fully committed to a certain modern physicalist, naturalist type of metaphysic. I think there's good reason to leave open alternatives that, say, can't neatly be fit into those categories. But if they are directly at odds with, say, a naturalistic understanding, I think that is a significant cause for concern and ought to draw our attention to some perhaps poor framings of the material understood historically from a, say, more traditional perspective. Yeah, here I want to get into a little bit of some of the ways that I think naturalism itself is not, say, a kind of master frame we want to have from a metamodern vantage point, even as it is a crucial and necessary perspective to be bringing to the table, and one with which we are required to work synthetically and ensure that whatever perspectives we are coming to, at the very least, are not in kind of outright tension with a serious naturalistic outlook. So let's take an example here of, say, Moses and the burning bush. This is not something that we really have access to historically. I mean, it comes through as an account in Scripture, and taking that as a straightforward historical account is obviously problematic for reasons I won't rehearse here. I don't know off the top of my head if there's any secondary historical sources here. I would personally be surprised if there were. But this is somewhat beside the point here. So, I mean, from a reified physicalist metaphysic, from a naturalistic metaphysic, even, the idea that a bush lit a flame and Moses proceeded to have this experience of God is certainly met with credulity, if not kind of outright denial. It's not something that seems to kind of happen according to the laws of kind of scientific causation that we're familiar with. But I don't think that alone is sufficient reason to, say, fully reject this as an authentic account of experience, which itself is not necessarily opposed to a certain naturalistic frame. So here, this is somewhat of a historical perspective. Then it's not saying that, oh, this event didn't happen. This sort of burning bush thing. It's kind of an allegory for the encounter with God and the numinous and the kind of moral responsibility that can spring forth from kind of realization of one's kind of relation to the ultimate. See, that's a kind of a very kind of symbolic interpretation. We've kind of collapsed the modality of that truth claim to mere symbolism or mere metaphor. And that's where I, in my somewhat more traditionalist sensibilities, get a little uncomfortable. I think there's some overreach, some hubris, some kind of we're deciding things a little a priori based on, again, a certain metaphysics that we've taken up, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it requires some additional reflection. So, what if we understand this Old Testament story not as physical history, as there was some kind of literal event of that the bush has lit a flame and Moses proceeds to have this experience, but perhaps it was an authentic experience nonetheless, and maybe even it could have had some physical sort of verifiable aspect to it, even though that question is likely foreclosed to us. There's likely simply not sources to be able to consider that question with any sort of certainty. But it's entirely plausible to me that this is a real experience by a real individual, and that it's not something we can reduce to, say, a naturalistic explanation of, oh, well, lightning struck a bush, and that's why it lit a flame, and there's something about the visual stimuli of this experience in the brain of this prophetic figure, then stimulated something to encourage some kind of peak experience, mystical state that then had this content, these revelations that were experienced. That's a plausible account of how this could be naturalized. But again, I think that's kind of overreaching. We're doing a lot of presumption here in terms of kind of trying to fit this experience into this naturalistic frame, and I don't think we necessarily need to do all that work. I'm kind of skeptical of again, getting a little too reified and refined and nailing down kind of specifics in that regard. But I think we can absolutely affirm the realness of this Old Testament story, not merely as allegory, not merely as something with like existential import, but as some kind of account of real experience. This is simply an account of a numinous mystical experience, and insofar as this is something that was actually experienced by a person, I think it is historical. It's, however, historical in a different mode than trying to read history as necessarily a physicalist account, objectively verifiable by other minds, etc. And I think this is helpful in a lot of ways. And again, I want to caution that we not sort of lock down as this sort of frame as experience as history. This is one possible modal approach to the truth value of scriptural sources that I think ought to be in the conversation, and I think its inclusion here is important for metamodern developments in religious thought, as kind of giving a way for the more traditionally minded folks within any given wisdom community to feel like they are still in contact with the reality of something that has real substance to it beyond just story as metaphor, as allegory, as symbol. There is a different phenomenology to this material if one considers it merely as some kind of symbolic, useful means to, say, achieving certain spiritual insights versus some kind of real account. And I think that phenomenology is important for especially the traditionalists, but I think we too lose something if we kind of foreclose access to seeing these things in say this light, where there's something real about the report, even if it's just a real report of experience. But I don't think we should see that as any kind of demotion versus, say, a more quote-unquote objective or naturalistic kind of history. I think, in fact, naturalistic history is kind of a subset of a broader kind of understanding of experience. This is one kind of experience, and you can also have these numinous experiences as well, and both of these can be reported, and both of these are things that actually happened in experience, even if they happened in experience in modally different ways. But I mean, I think there's lots of ways that even these types of peak mystical states, they're not necessarily only occurring in private subjectivities. There's plenty of sort of group or collective experiences of spiritual phenomena, mystical states. I kind of won't rehearse some more contemporary examples here, but there's certainly out there. And we need to be careful about sort of the epistemological value we give these sorts of things. We need to be careful how we sort of take up these experiences as data to build out metaphysics frameworks, these sorts of things. I mean, take a psychedelic experience, you can have all sorts of numinous encounters with entities and senses of being imparted with kind of divine knowledge, these sorts of things. And we don't want to sort of just uncritically take those experiences as a basis for our cosmologies, even as they, at least I certainly think, have a epistemological value, and there may very well be truths contained in these experiences revealed. But we want to put these in conversation in this kind of metamodern mode that I'm developing here with, modern historical perspectives and more naturalistic frames, with, say, more postmodern critical perspectives, and also the traditional perspectives that may provide some resources for mythically and cosmologically understanding some of these things on other levels. History as experience, I think, offers a really helpful way to understand the reality of such things, and not merely as kind of solipsistic, subjectivist reports. And here, my friendship with Alfred North Whitehead is helpful in building a bridge between experience and, say, the kind of physical aspect of the cosmos. These are not, from a Whiteheadian perspective, things that are at a kind of dualistic odds. There's this dipolar aspect. Experience springs forth from past actualities that are both physical and mental all the way down. So other forms of panpsychism may be helpful here, but without getting too technical, I mean, as kind of my sort of possible explanation naturalistically for the experience of Moses and the burning bush shows, like, there's ways that this type of subjective report may have a quote-unquote objective naturalistic basis, even as exploring the exact causation involved is going to be very speculative, and I don't think that's really where kind of the meat is in terms of thinking through the value and possible insights of some of these things. But I think it's the plausibility, the possibility of it grants a certain credence to this perspective. I don't think it can be reduced to kind of a naturalistic frame. Some of this is going to be semantics. Some people would say that history as experience is naturalistic. Others may not. But in any case, I think these sorts of moves are certainly not at odds with a naturalistic perspective, in the way where, say, the insisting upon the literal, physical, bodily resurrection of Jesus as a literal, physical history. Now you're in territory where there's a clear tension. But I mean, here too, you can do some gymnastics of. There's certainly ways that people who have kind of had a experience of death have sort of come back in an actual medical way. Perhaps the initial crucifixion was not nearly as fatal. These are possible moves you can make to rectify the kind of literal historical value of such things. But again, I think that's neither here nor there. And if those are the questions we are mostly getting bogged down with, I think we're kind of missing the point and losing out on possible opportunities for deeper synthesis here. Hopefully the kind of approach of history as experience or experience as history, along with this modal bracketing, keeping things open, not insisting one way or the other about the way in which an account in a scriptural source is true, while maintaining a critical attitude towards accounts which do kind of venture that this or that happening is true in a specific way. Hopefully these resources kind of make sense. I think all this and kind of helps keep the field open for the kind of dynamic hermeneutical engagement between modern, postmodern, traditional perspectives that I think is going to be at the heart of a kind of healthy and robust kind of metamodern expression of any of these wisdom traditions. So let me know your thoughts. Hope to keep the conversation going. So peace, salam.